Hi, welcome to this video. This is a kind of a small step in solving some trig problems. I just feel like, well, actually I'm teaching during this remote learning for this pandemic. So kind of just focusing on one day's lesson of how do you know whether to choose sine, cosine, or tangent when you're given a problem. And that's really all this video is going to do today. We're not going to actually solve any problems. We're going to identify reference angles. We're going to label a triangle with with the words hypotenuse, opposite, and adjacent. And then we're going to just choose whether we would use the sine in that particular problem, we would use the cosine in that particular problem, or would the tangent be more appropriate. So just to kind of get anchored, the sine of an angle, I didn't abbreviate there, is the opposite over the hypotenuse. I'll abbreviate the next two. Cosine of an angle is equal to the adjacent side over the hypotenuse, and the tangent of an angle is equal to the opposite over adjacent. And again, I've talked in previous videos what these are. So if you're starting off fresh and this is the first trig video you've watched of mine, it's probably not the best starting point. I would kind of go back and look at some other ones. SOHCAHTOA is, I have it written here as the mnemonic device that we kind of use to remember these three trig formulas. And they're something that we'll refer to. What I do is I just write it at the top of my paper anytime I think that I might have trig on an assessment or a worksheet or something like that. So let's just dive into the problem here. We have a triangle, and the first thing we want to do is identify the reference angle. First, before I talk about that, what I just want to say is this measure here, this symbol tells you that we have a 90-degree angle. That means that we have a right triangle. Everything we do in this video in introductory trigonometry is usually limited just to right triangles. So our reference angle will not be the right angle. All right, so when I always say the first step is to find the reference angle, it will not be the 90-degree angle in our right triangle trig. So the only other angle that they give us in this triangle is 48. So I'm just going to circle it so it's implanted in my head that I know that's a reference angle. Now what I'm going to do is label up the triangle based on a couple things. The hypotenuse is always opposite the right angle, so I'm labeling that H. The opposite side is opposite the reference angle, so I'm going to label that with an O for opposite. And then there's one side left, and that is the adjacent side. I always label that one last. It's a little more vague to find, I think, but I know that it's correct as well because it's also adjacent or next to that reference angle. So that's good. So now what we want to do is, again, we're not going to solve the problem, but we're going to kind of just anchor back and say, all right, what did the triangle originally have before we started marking it up? It had a reference angle, but it also had a 10 kilometers and a P. So the 10 kilometers is the adjacent side, and the P is the hypotenuse. So we need to choose the trig function that uses the adjacent side and the hypotenuse. So if we look at SOHCAHTOA, SO stands for sine, being the opposite over hypotenuse. That is not what we need. We need something with A and H. And if we look at the next one, cosine, that has A and H, the adjacent and the hypotenuse. We have it listed up here as well. So now that we know what we have represented, we know that we are going to use the cosine. And again, to solve this problem, we would go a little bit further with this, and I have another video that shows you how to do that. Okay, let's just take a couple more problems, and if you're starting to feel confident at any point, look at the problems, hit pause, figure out what your answer would be, and then you can hit play and see if you got them right. All right, let's take a peek at this top triangle. Again, we have a reference angle that's not the 90-degree angle. Now I need to label the sides. Opposite the 90 degrees is my hypotenuse. Opposite the reference angle is my opposite. Third side is my adjacent. When I look at the sides that were given to us before I started writing all over it, I have an H and I have an O. If I go to SOHCAHTOA, which one has O and H or H and O? That will be our sine. So for this one here, we are going to, if we were going to set up the problem, which would be the next step to solve it, we would use the sine ratio. All right, this triangle on the bottom, same format, identify the reference angle. Always do that first. Then we label the hypotenuse opposite the right angle. The opposite side is opposite the reference angle. And then the last side that's left over is the adjacent. What did we have before we started writing out all this? We have the hypotenuse, which was 8, and we have the opposite, which was 6, And so if we look up at our trig ratios, which one uses O and H? And again, for this one here, we would also use the sine ratio. All right, 2 more. This top picture, reference angle is here. We don't know the degrees, but that's okay. It's still the reference angle. It's clear because it's not the 90 degree and the other angle has nothing in it. Let's label up our triangle. So the hypotenuse is opposite the 90. The opposite is opposite the reference, and the third side will be the adjacent. What were we given before we started writing all over this? We were given that 12 was the hypotenuse and the adjacent is the 6. So I need to find the trig function that uses A and H. So is not going to work. The sine is O and H. Aha, cosine is A and H. So I would use the cosine trig ratio for that problem. And our last problem here. Again, we have a reference angle. Again, I don't know what it is, but that's okay. It's clearly the reference angle. Second step is to label up your triangle. That's the hypotenuse. That is the opposite. Third side will be the adjacent. The information that we were given at the beginning before we started writing on it is we knew 15 and we knew 21. Those two sides are the adjacent and the opposite. So when I look at SOHCAHTOA, I can go right through and just kind of look at it. I need O and A. O and A are not represented in sine. O and A are not represented in cosine. So for this problem, if we were going to continue solving it, we would use the tangent ratio. All right, and again, I do have subsequent videos that will show you how to continue this. How do you actually solve these? I think one of the videos is called Finding a Side Using Trig Ratios, and also Finding an Angle Using Trig Ratios. They'll carry these types of problems right till the end so you can kind of get an answer. All right, I hope this helped.